The sound of sirens was the last thing she expected to hear that night. Just when Amanda thought things had started to settle down, the life she worked so hard to build came crashing down. The kids screamed in terror as they ran to hide under their beds, hearing heavy footsteps approaching their front door. Their mother, Amanda, stood frozen, heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, there was the faint sound of a phone buzzing. It was the one thing she dreaded most in all the months of silence. The call she'd been hoping would never come. She turned around, looking at the phone screen. A call from Liam. She had waited so long for him to be free, had worked so hard, given up so much. Now, everything she feared was about to come true. She knew she had made a huge mistake, but there was no turning back. The sirens grew louder. The lights outside flashed through the blinds, casting an eerie red glow over the living room. Amanda's heart raced as the front door shook violently from the outside. The kids were whispering, trembling, hoping their mother would protect them from whatever was coming. What had she done? As the door began to splinter, Amanda's mind flashed back to the time she first met Liam. It had been a whirlwind romance. He was charming, full of promises, and had made her feel like the most special woman in the world. At the time, she hadn't known much about his past. The secret was buried, hidden behind his smiles and loving words. She'd never thought it would come to this, but now there was no hiding the truth. She had helped Liam get out of prison. She had used everything she had, money, favors, connections, to get him released early, even though he had been locked up for something terrible. He'd spent 5 years behind bars for a robbery that had gone horribly wrong, leaving a man dead. And now, just as the kids were starting to feel normal again, he was back. The very same Liam she thought she could trust. She had hoped the time apart would have changed him, that maybe prison would have made him see the error of his ways. But now, as the door creaked open, she knew she had been wrong. Liam's voice came through the phone, soft and cold. "I'm coming for you, Amanda. I'm coming for all of you." Before she could even respond, the phone line cut off. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. She ran to the front door, trying to lock it, but it was too late. The door slammed open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, eyes wide with rage and madness. "You're gonna regret this," Liam spat, his voice low and dangerous. Amanda tried to speak, tried to explain, but her words caught in her throat. She could only watch in horror as Liam walked into the house, his eyes scanning the room. It was the moment she had been dreading. The moment she realized the man she had once loved was someone completely different now. Liam's gaze fixed on her 2 children, hiding behind the couch, shaking in fear. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a dark, twisted grin. "So, this is how you've been living? With these little ones? My things have changed, haven't they?" Amanda stepped forward, trying to protect her kids. "Liam, please, don't do this. I did what I thought was best, but this isn't you. You're better than this." But Liam's eyes narrowed, and his smile disappeared. "You think you can change me, Amanda? You think you can control me now? You should have known better. You should have stayed out of it." He slowly walked toward her, each step sending chills down her spine. The air in the room grew colder, and Amanda's heart felt like it was beating in her throat. She couldn't let Liam get any closer to her children. They were all she had left. She was the only one who could protect them now. And then it happened. In an instant, Liam's expression changed. His eyes flashed with something darker, something terrifying. He lunged toward the kids, knocking over the furniture in his way. Amanda screamed, rushing forward, but it was too late. Her world went black for a moment, and when she opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor, her body aching from the impact. She could hear the sounds of muffled screams and the heavy footsteps of someone approaching. The terror on her children's faces was seared into her mind. Liam was still in the house. What had he done? Was he really capable of going that far? What happened next would forever change Amanda's life, and she wasn't sure if she could survive the consequences. As the sound of the footsteps grew closer, Amanda's heart raced. She had to make a choice. What would she do to protect her children? But just as she was about to push herself off the floor, the doorbell rang. And that's when she heard it. A voice from the other side of the door, calling her name. Amanda. Who was it? Would it be the help she desperately needed? Or was this just the beginning of something far worse? Amanda's heart skipped a beat. The voice outside was familiar, but it was not the person she expected. She scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her as she tried to make sense of the chaos in her home. The kids were still hiding, crying softly behind the couch, their small bodies trembling in fear. The house was dark, save for the red glow of the flashing lights outside, and the weight of Liam's presence in the room was suffocating. The doorbell rang again, followed by the same voice, this time more urgent. Amanda, open the door. It's me, Detective Harris. Amanda's heart raced even faster. Detective Harris? He was the one who had worked on Liam's case years ago, the man who had always warned her about getting involved with someone like Liam. But why was he here? How did he know? With one last glance at her children, Amanda rushed to the door. She quickly locked the inner deadbolt, but before she could reach for the knob to open it, the door swung open from the other side, sending her stumbling backward. Detective Harris stood there, looking more worried than she had ever seen him. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around the room, taking in the mess and the palpable tension in the air. Behind him was a police officer, holding a large flashlight. They were both clearly on edge, but Amanda didn't have time to think about it. Amanda, where is he? Where's Liam? Harris asked, his voice low and strained. He's inside, Harris, she whispered, almost too scared to say it out loud. He's here, and he's not alone. He's gone mad. The detective's expression hardened. I need to see him now, and I need to make sure the kids are safe. Amanda's heart clenched. She had no idea what had happened in the few moments since Liam had entered the house, but one thing was clear. He was unpredictable, dangerous. She had hoped that the presence of the police would calm him down, but she wasn't sure anymore. Was it too late to fix this? I don't know if it's safe, Amanda said, her voice shaking. He's gone crazy. He's threatening the kids. I don't know what he's going to do next. Detective Harris's jaw tightened. Listen to me, Amanda. We're going to get this under control. I've been tracking Liam for a while now. We know what he's capable of, but you need to stay calm. We can't let him hurt anyone. Amanda nodded, but her stomach twisted. What had she gotten herself into? All she had wanted was to get Liam out of prison so they could have a second chance. But now, it was all falling apart. Where is he? Harris asked again, his voice firm. He stepped into the house, his hand on his gun, the flashlight scanning the dark corners of the living room. Amanda stepped aside, not sure what to do next. She could only point toward the hallway. He went that way. Stay here with the kids, Harris ordered. He looked over his shoulder at the officer, who nodded and followed him down the hallway toward the bedrooms. Amanda hesitated for a moment, feeling a sharp pang of dread. She wanted to run to her kids, but she couldn't leave the detective alone with Liam. What if something went wrong? What if this was all just leading to a much worse situation? The sound of footsteps grew louder as Harris and the officer approached Liam's last known location. Amanda's eyes flicked toward the hallway. She wanted to call out, to warn them, but she knew it would only make things worse. She just had to trust Harris. He had to be able to handle this. And then, suddenly, a loud crash echoed from down the hall. The sound of furniture breaking, followed by the unmistakable shouts of Liam. Amanda's heart froze. Oh no, she whispered to herself. The kids screamed in terror from the other room. Amanda turned to them, her mind racing. She had to act fast. She couldn't just wait for things to spiral further out of control. Panic surged through her, and she rushed to the hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. But when she reached the corner, she stopped cold. There, standing at the threshold of her bedroom, was Liam. His eyes were wild with rage, and he had a knife in his hand, holding it out in front of him like a weapon. Blood was dripping from his arm, but he didn't seem to notice. He was glaring directly at Detective Harris, who was standing a few feet away, his gun aimed at Liam, but frozen in place. Get away from my family, Harris. Liam shouted, his voice full of venom. You think you can control me? You think you can stop me? Amanda felt a chill run down her spine as Liam's words rang in her ears. He was beyond reasoning now. The man she had known was gone, replaced by someone unpredictable, dangerous. "Liam, please," Amanda called out, stepping forward. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to hurt anyone." But Liam didn't even glance at her. He was focused entirely on Harris, his grip tightening on the knife. "Stay out of this, Amanda," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "This is between me and him." The standoff in the hallway was like something from a nightmare. Amanda felt as though she was trapped in the middle of a storm, with nowhere to run. The tension was unbearable, the silence deafening, except for the distant sound of her children crying. And then, just when it seemed like everything might explode, Liam's voice broke the quiet. "Get ready for what's coming next, Amanda. You have no idea how far I'll go." Amanda's heart dropped. What did that mean? Before she could process the meaning of Liam's words, the knife flashed in the dim light, and the detective stepped forward, trying to take control of the situation. But what would happen next? Was the nightmare just beginning? The tension in the house was thick, like the air before a storm. Liam's crazed eyes were fixed on Detective Harris, who was doing everything he could to push the man back. Harris had pulled his weapon but had no clear shot. Liam was moving too fast, too erratically. The detective stumbled back, his grip faltering. Amanda's pulse raced as she saw the struggle unfold before her eyes. Liam wasn't the man she used to know. He wasn't the man she had hoped to save. This person before her was dangerous, unpredictable, and full of rage. Amanda's mind spun, trying to think of a way to stop this. She needed to act, and fast. "Get off him!" she shouted, her voice strained with fear. But Liam's attention was elsewhere. His rage seemed to block out everything around him. The detective, now pinned to the floor, struggled to free himself, his face pale with pain. Amanda knew that if Liam wasn't stopped now, there was no telling what would happen next. She couldn't let him hurt anyone. The officer who had been with Detective Harris pulled out his taser, aiming it directly at Liam. The crackling sound of electricity filled the air as the officer fired. The taser darts hit their mark, and Liam staggered for a moment as the shock coursed through his body. But he didn't go down. Instead, Liam grunted in pain and yanked the wires from his body, pushing forward with terrifying strength. His body shook, but he seemed to grow stronger with every jolt of electricity. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as Liam turned his focus to the officer. His movements were wild, almost animalistic, and Amanda could see that the situation was spiraling out of control. "Stay back," the officer shouted, holding the taser out defensively, but it was clear that they were running out of options. Liam was unstoppable. Amanda's mind raced. There had to be something she could do. In that moment of panic, she spotted something, a heavy ceramic vase on the side table. Without thinking, she grabbed it, her hand shaking as she hurled it toward Liam. The vase hit him square in the back of the head, and for a split second, he faltered. It wasn't much, but it was enough to distract him, just long enough for the officer to fire the taser once more. This time, Liam couldn't resist. The electricity surged through his body again, and this time, he collapsed to the floor, convulsing from the shock. Amanda rushed to Harris, kneeling beside him. His face was pale, blood soaking through his shirt as he gasped for air. "Hold on, Harris," Amanda whispered desperately, pressing her hand to his wound in an attempt to stop the bleeding. "You have to stay with me." But even as she tried to reassure herself, she knew they weren't out of danger yet. Liam was still breathing, and no one knew how long he would stay down. The officer stepped cautiously toward Liam, but Amanda's focus was on her children. She had to get them out of here. And then, a voice called out from behind her. "Mom." Amanda turned quickly to see Max standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Max, get back," Amanda shouted, panic rising in her chest. But it was too late. Her son, seeing the danger his mother was in, didn't hesitate. He grabbed a metal rod from the wreckage in the hallway, something from the broken furniture, and ran toward Liam. Without thinking, he swung the rod with all his strength. It hit Liam across the back, knocking him to the ground once more. Amanda's heart skipped a beat. Her son had just saved her life. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. Liam was still on the floor, twitching slightly, But Amanda knew that the danger was far from over. Liam was strong, and he had just proven how unpredictable he was. The sirens were getting closer. But would they be in time to stop Liam? And what would happen when he regained his strength? Amanda's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked at her children. She had saved them once, but what would happen next? This night was far from over, and Amanda feared the worst was still to come. The silence after Liam collapsed was deafening. The sirens outside were growing louder, but inside the house, it felt as if time had stopped. Amanda kept her eyes on Liam, who lay motionless on the floor, still twitching from the effects of the taser. She didn't dare take her eyes off him, not for a second. She knew that just when it seemed safe, it often wasn't. Max stood next to her, gripping the metal rod tightly, his small hands shaking. He was terrified, but Amanda could see the determination in his eyes. He had saved her life, but he didn't understand yet how dangerous things were. He was just a kid, and Amanda wanted to protect him from all of this, but she knew she couldn't. Not now. Mom, is he gone? Max asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His wide eyes never left Liam's prone form. Amanda's chest tightened. She wanted to tell Max everything would be okay, but she couldn't lie to him. Not now. I don't know, she said, her voice hoarse. Stay close, Max. She turned her attention back to Harris, who was still lying on the floor. Blood soaked his uniform, and his breathing was shallow. Amanda quickly knelt beside him again, pressing her hands firmly to his wound. The detective's face was pale, his body trembling from the shock of the injury and the pain. Harris, stay with me, Amanda urged, her voice cracking. You have to stay with me. We can't lose you now. Harris blinked slowly, trying to focus. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. Finally, he managed to whisper, "He's not done." Amanda's stomach churned. She knew exactly what he meant. Despite everything they had done to subdue Liam, he was still alive, still dangerous. She had no doubt that he would recover soon enough, and when he did, there was no telling what he would do. Before Amanda could respond, the door burst open, and two paramedics rushed into the room, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. What happened? One of them asked as they immediately knelt down to tend to Harris. We need to get him to the hospital, Amanda said quickly, her voice frantic. Now. He's bleeding too much. The paramedics nodded, but as they worked to stabilize Harris, Amanda couldn't tear her eyes away from Liam. He was still breathing, but the man who had once been the love of her life was now a complete stranger, a dangerous one. She had to get her children out of there. They couldn't stay. A loud crash made her snap her head toward the hallway. Liam was moving. He was pushing himself to his feet, his eyes wide and wild. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, unsteady, but then his gaze locked onto Amanda, and she saw the pure, unrelenting fury in his eyes. Amanda's heart dropped. He was awake. He was back. Max stepped forward, holding the metal rod tightly in his hands, ready to protect his mother again. But Amanda couldn't risk it. She couldn't let Liam get to him. Max, get behind me, Amanda ordered, her voice sharp with urgency. She took a step forward, trying to put herself between her children and Liam. Liam, please, she said, her voice trembling. This isn't you. Please, just stop. We can figure this out. You don't have to do this. But Liam's face was a mask of rage. You think you can stop me now? He snarled, his voice low and dangerous. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched as if to grab her, but it was clear he wasn't thinking straight. His movements were erratic, like a man who had lost all control. Stay back, Amanda shouted. She reached for something, anything, to defend herself. Her hand found a broken chair leg, and she held it like a weapon, her fingers gripping it tightly. Max stood behind her, his eyes wide with fear, but he didn't run. He didn't leave her side. Liam laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You can't protect them. You can't save anyone. Before Amanda could react, there was another loud noise. The sound of the front door slamming open. Police. Freeze. The voice was unmistakable. It was the other officer who had been with Harris. Liam froze for just a second, his gaze shifting toward the officer who had his gun aimed directly at him. But that brief moment of hesitation was all Amanda needed. She rushed toward the officer, her heart pounding. "Please, don't hurt him," she said, desperation flooding her voice. "He's sick. He's not himself." But the officer didn't lower his gun. "Stay back," he warned, his voice steely. "I don't know who he is anymore. But he's a threat, and we need to neutralize him." Amanda's chest tightened. "You don't understand. He's not just a criminal. He's someone I—" "Shut up, lady," the officer barked. "This is over." Just then, Liam lunged. Everything happened in a blur. The officer fired, but Liam was faster. He dodged the shot, stumbling toward Amanda in a frenzied rage. Amanda didn't know what to do. Her heart was racing, and she could hear Max behind her, terrified. She had to act. She had no choice. In a flash, Amanda swung the broken chair leg at Liam. The impact hit him in the shoulder, sending him off balance. The officer fired again, and this time, the bullet hit Liam in the leg. Liam screamed, collapsing to the floor. The room was filled with the sound of sirens as more officers arrived, rushing into the house. But it was clear, the danger was far from over. Amanda's body was shaking with adrenaline, but she couldn't relax. Not yet. Liam was down for now, but how long would it last? Would he get up again? Would the officers be able to control him for good? And as Amanda looked at her children, she realized something terrifying. This nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The sound of sirens blared outside, but inside, the house was eerily quiet. The moment Liam had fallen to the ground, it felt like time had slowed down. Amanda stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The officers who had arrived rushed to Liam's side, handcuffing him quickly, but no one was sure what would happen next. Liam was still conscious, his breathing heavy and strained, but he wasn't fighting anymore. He lay on the ground, staring up at the ceiling with a mix of confusion and hatred in his eyes. Amanda's legs felt like jelly as she collapsed onto the couch, her entire body trembling from the tension. Max, standing beside her, was wide-eyed and silent, still clutching the metal rod. Amanda reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly as she looked at her son. She didn't know how to make this better for him. "Mom, what's happening?" Max whispered, his voice thick with fear. His wide eyes darted to the officers who were now securing Liam, making sure he couldn't move. Amanda opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? That she tried to save him? That she thought Liam was still the man she loved? That everything had gone terribly wrong? "I don't know, Max," she finally managed to say. "I really don't." The officer who had fired the shot earlier approached her cautiously, his face grim. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. He was tall, his uniform crisp and professional, but his eyes held something else, concern. I'm fine," Amanda replied, her voice strained. "I just need to make sure the kids are okay." The officer nodded. "We'll take care of him, but we need to ask you some questions." Amanda nodded numbly. "Of course. I'll answer anything you need." As the officers continued to work on securing Liam, Amanda's mind was spinning. She couldn't shake the image of his eyes, the rage, the madness that had taken over him. Liam had always been unpredictable, but this was something else entirely. The detective, Harris, had been carted away to the hospital, and Amanda was left alone with the officers, her children, and a life she wasn't sure how to piece together anymore. Max sat down next to her, still shaken. His little sister, Sophie, was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Amanda wished she could take it all away, make it as if nothing had happened, but she knew that wasn't possible. "Is Liam going to go to jail, Mom?" Max asked softly, his voice laced with worry. Amanda closed her eyes for a moment, then sighed. "Yes, Max. He's going to jail. He's hurt a lot of people, but we're going to be okay. I promise." Max looked at her, searching her face as though trying to read her. He wasn't sure if he could believe her, not after everything they had just gone through. And Amanda couldn't blame him. A few moments later, an officer returned to her side, holding a small notepad. "Ma'am, we need your statement. Can you tell us what happened?" Amanda nodded, still dazed. She took a deep breath before speaking, trying to gather her thoughts. Liam, he's my boyfriend. He was in prison for a long time, but I got him out. I thought maybe, if he could come home, if we could just start over, things would be better. She paused, her voice catching in her throat. But when he came home, he wasn't the same. Something was wrong with him. He started acting like a different person. I couldn't control him. He was angry, violent. And then tonight, he attacked Harris. He hurt him. The officer jotted down notes, his face hardening. You mentioned he was in prison. Do you know what he was convicted of? Amanda hesitated. He was convicted of assault. Multiple times. But that's not him. Not really. I thought he'd changed. The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. He seemed to be processing her words, his expression unreadable. Where did you meet him? The officer continued. Amanda took a shaky breath, the memories flooding back. We met years ago, before he went to prison. He was kind, sweet. I believed in him. I thought if we could just be together, everything would be okay. She paused, her hands trembling as she wrung them together. But I was wrong. I didn't see it, the rage, the darkness inside of him. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could save him. The officer set his notepad down and looked at her with a mixture of pity and sympathy. I'm sorry you had to go through that, ma'am. But you need to understand that sometimes people can't change, no matter how hard we try. Amanda nodded silently, the tears welling in her eyes. She had tried so hard. And now, everything she had worked for, everything she had hoped for, was shattered. Max, sensing her sadness, took her hand gently. Mom, we're gonna be okay, right? Amanda looked down at her son, her heart breaking. She wanted to tell him everything would be fine, that they could go back to their normal lives. But she knew it wasn't that simple. They had been changed forever, whether they wanted to be or not. We will be, Max, she whispered. We'll be okay. I'm not giving up on us. But even as she said the words, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. She wasn't sure what, but she knew they hadn't seen the last of Liam. And as she looked at the officers continuing their work in the house, she realized that the nightmare was far from over. The weight of everything that had happened that night settled over Amanda like a thick, suffocating blanket. She sat in the small, dimly lit living room, the air heavy with the hum of the police radios and the voices of officers as they continued their work. Max and Sophie sat beside her, both of them visibly shaken but trying to be strong. Amanda couldn't blame them. She was trying to hold herself together too. The police had finally taken Liam away, but Amanda's mind couldn't rest. What had she gotten herself and her children into? She had been so sure that bringing him home, getting him out of prison, would somehow fix things. Instead, she had put them all in more danger than ever. The officers had asked a dozen questions, each one harder than the last. They had already gathered enough information about Liam's past and his recent behavior, but they were still trying to piece together what had led to this violent outburst. They weren't getting any clear answers from Liam, of course. He had been taken to the station, but Amanda knew that the truth about what had happened to him, the anger, the madness that seemed to possess him, would never fully make sense. She stood up suddenly, her mind racing. She needed air. She needed to think. Mom, where are you going? Max's voice was quiet, filled with worry. I'm just stepping outside for a minute, Amanda replied softly, her eyes briefly meeting his. She forced a smile, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't a little boy anymore. Max understood far too much. I'll be right back. Without waiting for a response, Amanda stepped outside, her feet carrying her to the front porch. The night was cold, but she barely noticed. She leaned against the railing, staring out into the darkness, the only sound the distant wail of sirens fading away. The world felt like it had turned upside down in the span of a few hours. Everything she thought she knew about Liam, everything she had convinced herself of, had been shattered. He wasn't the person she had once loved. He wasn't even close. Amanda closed her eyes, trying to sort through her jumbled thoughts. What had happened to him? What had gone wrong? She remembered the old Liam, the one who had laughed with her, the one who had held her hand and promised to build a future together. She had seen the good in him, believed in it with all her heart. But the man she had seen tonight, the violence, the rage in his eyes, that wasn't Liam. That was something else. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She fumbled for it, her hands trembling as she saw the caller ID. It was Detective Harris. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered the call. Detective Harris? Is everything okay? Amanda, Harris's voice came through, weak but steady. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I need you to know something. Amanda's stomach turned. What is it? What happened? Harris paused for a moment before continuing. We've been going through some of the evidence, the stuff we found when we brought Liam in. There's something you need to understand. Something about Liam's recent behavior. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? What did you find? We're not sure yet, but we found signs of something psychological. He's been under the influence of something, Amanda, something powerful. And I think it's worse than we originally thought. Her mind raced. What are you saying? What's wrong with him? We think he's been involved in something more than just anger. We believe he may have been manipulated, even controlled. There are patterns in his behavior that suggest someone has been pulling the strings. Someone who's not going to let this go. Amanda felt her pulse quicken. Who? Who could be behind this? I don't know yet, Harris replied, his voice grim. But I need you to stay alert. Stay safe. Whoever is behind this isn't going to stop with Liam. They'll come after anyone they see as a threat. And you need to be ready. Amanda stood motionless, her mind racing. The words echoed in her mind. Manipulated. Controlled. Someone pulling the strings. It didn't make sense. Who could have done that to Liam? And why? Her hand trembled as she clutched the phone tighter. What do I do, Harris? What do I need to do? I'll be in touch, Harris said, his voice strained. Just keep your guard up. And don't trust anyone right now. You don't know who you can rely on. Before Amanda could respond, the line went dead. She stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, staring out into the dark night, trying to make sense of it all. Who had done this to Liam? Who was controlling him? The feeling of dread, the sense that something far darker than she could comprehend was unfolding, grew stronger with each passing second. She had been so focused on Liam, on trying to fix him, that she had missed something crucial. Something bigger was at play, and it wasn't just Liam who was in danger. It was all of them. Amanda's breath quickened as the realization hit her. The nightmare was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Amanda returned inside, her mind still spinning from the call with Detective Harris. She had to tell someone. Someone who could help, someone who would understand the gravity of the situation. But what could she say? The pieces didn't fit. A part of her wanted to believe this was just a misunderstanding, that maybe Harris had been mistaken, but the feeling in her gut told her something much darker was at play. She stood in the living room, staring at Max and Sophie, both of whom were now sitting closer together, watching her with wide eyes. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew something was terribly wrong. Mom, who was that? Max asked, his voice full of concern. Is it about Liam? Amanda hesitated, trying to put the jumbled thoughts together. It was Detective Harris, she said softly, walking over to sit beside them. He said there's more going on than we thought. Something is controlling Liam. We're not sure who or what, but it's not just him anymore. He's being used. Max's face twisted in confusion. Used? Like, by who? Amanda shook her head, not having an answer herself. I don't know, Max. I don't know who would do this to him, or why. But we need to be careful. Whoever did this, whoever is behind it, they're dangerous. Sophie, who had been silent until now, looked up at her mom with her big brown eyes. Does that mean Liam is bad now? She asked quietly. Amanda's heart broke at the question. Sophie was just a little girl, and she had already witnessed more fear and confusion than any child should. No, sweetie, Amanda whispered, brushing Sophie's hair from her face. Liam isn't bad. Something happened to him. Something made him hurt people. But we're going to figure this out. Max, clearly not satisfied with his mother's explanation, pressed, but what if we can't? What if we can't stop whoever did this to him? Amanda's chest tightened. Max was always the more practical one, but hearing his worry made it feel all too real. She couldn't let her kids live in fear. They had already been through too much. "We will stop them," Amanda said firmly, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. "We'll figure out who's behind this and make sure they don't hurt anyone else. I promise." There was a long pause. Max stared at her, still unconvinced. Amanda forced a smile, hoping to reassure him, but deep down, she knew the real danger was just beginning to unfold. A sharp knock at the door cut through the tense silence. Amanda jumped up, startled by the sudden interruption. She exchanged a look with Max before walking cautiously toward the door. Her heart pounded in her chest. When she opened it, she was faced with an officer from the local precinct. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face serious. Behind him, she could see the flashing lights of a squad car. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice low, "I'm sorry to disturb you, but we need to ask you a few more questions. There's been a development." Amanda felt her stomach drop. "A development?" she repeated, trying to mask the rising fear in her voice. The officer nodded grimly. "We just received a call. There's been another incident. Something's happened with Liam." "Liam's in custody," Amanda replied, her voice tight with confusion. "What do you mean, another incident?" The officer hesitated, glancing behind him, and then stepped closer to Amanda. "We've been getting reports of strange behavior all over town. People have seen him acting strangely, almost like he's being controlled. There's something else going on, and we need to find out what it is fast." Amanda's breath caught in her throat. This was the last thing she needed. "What are you saying? That Liam escaped?" The officer nodded slowly. "We're not sure how, but he's gone. And from the looks of it, he's not alone." Amanda felt her knees go weak. Her thoughts raced as she processed the officer's words. Liam was out again, and whoever, or whatever, was controlling him was still out there. She had to get her children out of there. She couldn't wait around. If the danger was closer than she thought, she needed to act now. "Where is he?" Amanda asked, her voice shaky. "We don't know," the officer said, his expression grim. "But we've got units out looking for him. We'll find him, but we need your help. If you know anything at all, about who could be behind this, we need to hear it." Amanda looked at Max and Sophie, both of them silently watching from behind her. She wanted to protect them from this nightmare, but she knew they weren't safe until this was over. She didn't know where to start, but she had a feeling they were getting closer to the truth. Something, or someone, was pulling Liam's strings, and it wasn't just a random act of violence. "I don't know anything," Amanda whispered, her voice distant, "but I'll help. I have to." The officer nodded, his face serious. "Good. We'll be in touch. Stay inside, lock your doors, and don't let anyone in unless you're sure it's safe. We'll be watching." He turned and walked back toward the squad car, leaving Amanda standing in the doorway, her heart pounding with fear. She closed the door behind her and locked it. The house suddenly felt smaller, more suffocating. Every creak, every small noise made her jump. She had failed. She had failed to protect Liam, and now it was too late. Whatever had been unleashed could not be stopped easily. It was only a matter of time before it came after her family. Max stepped forward. "Mom, we can't just sit here. We have to do something." Amanda looked down at her son, and for a moment, she saw the same fear in his eyes that she had felt when she was his age. It wasn't just about protecting her kids anymore. It was about surviving. "We'll figure it out, Max," she said quietly. "We'll do what we have to. But we're not alone in this. We're going to get through this together." But even as she said the words, Amanda knew that the real battle was just beginning. And it was one they might not be able to win. The hours passed slowly, each minute dragging by like an eternity. Amanda sat on the couch, her eyes never leaving the door. Her mind raced, jumping from one terrifying thought to the next. Max and Sophie had gone to bed, but she couldn't sleep. She knew she had to keep them safe, but every passing minute made her feel like they were in more danger. The phone had remained silent since the officer's visit. Amanda kept checking it, hoping for some kind of update, but nothing came. It was almost as if the world outside had gone still, waiting for something. Waiting for what, exactly? She didn't know. She jumped when she heard the sound of glass breaking. Her heart leaped into her throat, and before she could even think, she was on her feet, running toward the sound. "Max? Sophie?" she called as she hurried down the hall. There was no answer, only the eerie silence that hung over the house like a shroud. She reached the kids' room first, pushing the door open in a panic. To her relief, they were both still in bed, their faces peaceful in sleep. Her pulse didn't slow. The sound hadn't come from their room. She moved cautiously, her steps silent on the creaky floorboards, until she reached the living room again. A loud crash sounded from the kitchen. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved toward it. What if Liam had returned? What if someone else was in the house? She paused in the doorway of the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room. At first, everything seemed normal, just a mess of disarray. Pots and pans scattered across the floor, the sink filled with dishes. But then she saw it. The back door was open. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. The lock was broken. The glass from the door's window had been shattered, lying in sharp shards on the floor. Her mind raced, wondering if it was Liam who had done this, or if someone else had gained access to the house. Whoever it was, they had entered with intent, and Amanda had no idea whether they were still there. She grabbed a nearby broom handle, holding it like a weapon. The sound of distant sirens reached her ears, but they felt miles away. She wasn't sure if they were getting closer, or if it was just a fleeting echo. Either way, the help she needed wasn't here yet. Creeping through the kitchen, Amanda's eyes darted toward the living room window. She could see the shadow of a figure moving outside, just beyond the yard. It was too far away to make out, but the distinct feeling of being watched crept over her. She couldn't risk letting anyone, especially Liam, sneak up on her family. Without thinking, Amanda backed away from the window and grabbed her phone, dialing the first number that came to mind. Detective Harris. The phone rang, but there was no answer. She tried again, panic rising in her chest. "Please pick up," she whispered under her breath. The third ring was answered, but it wasn't Harris's voice on the other end. "This is Officer Parks, ma'am," the voice said. "What's going on?" Amanda's breath hitched in her throat. "Someone's here. I think they've broken into my house. The back door's shattered, and I saw a shadow outside. I don't know who it is, but it's not safe. I need help." "Stay calm, Amanda," Officer Parks said, his voice sounding unshaken. "We're on our way. Just stay inside and lock the doors. Don't let anyone in." "I can't," Amanda gasped. "I think it's Liam. I think he's come back. He's being controlled by someone else. There's something wrong with him. Please, just hurry." Officer Parks didn't respond immediately, but Amanda could hear him speaking to someone else on his end. She could only assume he was notifying additional units. Finally, he spoke again. "Stay where you are. We're 10 minutes out. Just hold tight." 10 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. Amanda hung up, taking a few steadying breaths. 10 minutes was far too long. She had no choice but to act. Her hand trembling, she grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and slipped out the front door, moving as quietly as possible. The night air was cold against her skin, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her. The street was dark, the streetlights flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Amanda crept along the side of the house, toward the backyard. She could still hear the faint sound of movement, footsteps, too heavy to be anyone she knew. She reached the corner of the house and peeked around. The yard was empty, the tree in the distance swaying slightly in the breeze. But then she saw something that made her blood run cold. A dark figure, standing motionless by the broken back door. Amanda's heart pounded in her ears. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get back inside, but her feet felt frozen. What if it was Liam? What if this was the moment everything came to a head? The figure moved suddenly, stepping closer to the door, and Amanda realized that it wasn't Liam. It was someone else entirely, someone far more dangerous. She knew this person. She recognized the way he walked, the broad shoulders, the unmistakable stance. It was Derek, the same Derek who had been Liam's cellmate in prison. Amanda remembered the way Derek had looked at her when he'd been released, the strange way he'd lingered too long in their old neighborhood, as if watching them. Derek wasn't just connected to Liam. He was the one pulling the strings. He had been the silent force behind Liam's violent breakdown, and now, Amanda realized, he was the one who had been controlling everything. Derek stopped just short of the door and glanced around, his eyes scanning the yard. Amanda knew that if he saw her, if he realized she had figured it out, he would stop at nothing to finish what he had started. She had to act. Amanda quickly ducked back behind the corner of the house, holding her breath as Derek turned his head, his eyes narrowing. She could feel the weight of her own heartbeat in her chest. There wasn't much time left. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed her back against the cold brick of the house. She had to think fast. Derek was dangerously close now, and if he discovered she was here, it would all be over. She didn't know what he wanted, but it was clear he wasn't here for any good reason. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. Max, Sophie, and the house were all vulnerable. She couldn't let Derek know she was onto him. She needed a plan, and fast. Amanda turned and crept along the side of the house, staying out of sight. The dim light of the street lamps cast long shadows across the yard, but Derek was too far into the darkness to notice. She reached the front door, still clutching the flashlight in her hand like a lifeline, though she had no real plan of defense. She turned the knob as quietly as possible and slipped inside, locking the door behind her. Inside, everything was eerily silent. The house felt smaller now, as though it were closing in on her. Amanda stood in the hallway for a moment, gathering herself. Max and Sophie were still upstairs, still unaware of the danger just outside. She tiptoed up the stairs, careful not to make a sound. When she reached the top, she crept down the hall to Max and Sophie's room. She had to warn them without alarming them too much. They were young, and this whole situation was already far too much for them to process. Max was still awake, his eyes wide as he looked at her. "Mom," he whispered. "Hush, Max," Amanda whispered urgently, putting her finger to her lips. "We need to be quiet. There's someone outside. I think it's Derek. I need you and Sophie to stay in here, and don't make a sound, okay?" Max nodded, his face pale. He had always been the mature one, but even he seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation. Sophie, however, had started to stir in her bed, her little eyes squinting against the dim light. "Mom? What's happening?" Sophie's voice was small, but her fear was evident. Amanda knelt beside her, brushing Sophie's hair from her face. "We're going to be fine, sweetie. Just stay quiet, all right? Everything will be okay." Sophie nodded, though her wide eyes never left Amanda's face. Amanda kissed her forehead gently, then stood up and turned toward Max. "Stay here. Don't come out until I say it's safe," Amanda instructed. Max didn't argue. He simply nodded again, his lips pressed tight together as he watched her leave the room. Amanda crept down the hallway, her every step measured, feeling the weight of the seconds ticking by. She needed to know what Derek was doing. He had to be the key to understanding everything that had been happening with Liam, and now with the violence he had unleashed. She reached the top of the stairs and peered out the front window. Derek was still out in the yard, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed to be watching something, maybe waiting for something to happen, or someone. Amanda's mind raced. She needed to find a way to stall him, to buy herself enough time for the police to arrive. But what if the police were already too late? What if Derek had already done something to Liam? Amanda's pulse quickened at the thought. She couldn't think like that. She had to stay calm. She had to protect her kids. She reached for her phone, intending to call Detective Harris again, but stopped when she saw the flashing lights outside. She pressed her hand to the glass, watching as the squad cars pulled up. The cavalry had arrived, but something about the way the officers were moving didn't feel right. They were tense, their hands hovering over their holsters as they approached the house. Amanda's stomach dropped. They were here for a reason, and it wasn't just to arrest Derek. Something bigger was happening. She could feel it. Amanda hurried to the front door and opened it just a crack, trying to keep her presence unnoticed. She watched as the officers spread out around the perimeter of the house, scanning the area. Derek had not yet noticed them. Then, without warning, Derek turned and began walking toward the front yard. Amanda's heart raced. He couldn't get to the officers. If Derek saw them, it would all go downhill. Before she could stop herself, Amanda rushed out the door, moving quickly but quietly, staying in the shadows. She reached the nearest officer, grabbing his arm as he passed. "Detective," she whispered urgently. "It's Derek. He's the one who's been controlling Liam. He's out there. He has to be stopped." The officer's eyes widened as he turned to face her. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low but serious.
"Yes,"
Amanda said, desperation in her voice. "I saw him. He's the one behind it all. He's not just connected to Liam. He's controlling him. He's been making him do horrible things." The officer didn't hesitate. He motioned to the other officers, signaling them to take positions. "Stay here," he ordered Amanda. "We'll handle this. You need to get back inside." Amanda nodded, her heart hammering as she reluctantly stepped back. She had done all she could to warn them. Now, she could only pray that they would catch Derek before he could do any more damage. But just as she was about to retreat into the house, Derek froze. He had seen them. His eyes locked onto the officers, and his stance shifted. It was as if the entire air around him changed. He became even more dangerous, more unpredictable. Amanda watched, her breath catching in her throat, as Derek lifted his hand slowly, his fingers twitching in a way that made her blood run cold. He was ready to fight. The officers moved in, but Derek was faster. He lunged toward one of them, grabbing his arm and twisting it with an unnatural force. The officer yelled out in pain, but Derek didn't stop. He pulled the officer close, his eyes wild with fury. Amanda's hands clenched into fists. This was it. It was now or never. She needed to make sure her children were safe. But this was bigger than just Derek. There was something else in play, something much more dangerous. She turned to rush back inside, her mind set on one thing only, her kids. Amanda's mind was racing as she sprinted back into the house, slamming the door behind her. The sound of Derek's chaotic struggle with the officers echoed through the walls, but it was far too distant now. Her focus was solely on her children, Max and Sophie. They were her world, and nothing else mattered. She reached their room in seconds, throwing open the door. Max and Sophie were both sitting up in bed, their faces etched with worry. The fear in their eyes twisted her heart into knots. She knew they hadn't heard everything outside, but they could feel the tension in the air. "Mom, what's happening?" Max asked, his voice trembling. "Stay close to me," Amanda whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's no time to explain. We need to go right now." Max nodded, and Sophie, too young to fully understand, simply clung to her mother, trusting her without question. Amanda quickly grabbed the bag she had packed earlier, clothes, phones, essentials, and ushered them out of the room. Every second felt like a countdown. As they hurried down the stairs, Amanda's thoughts were a blur. How long would the officers be able to hold Derek off? She had no idea, but she couldn't wait around to find out. She had to get her kids out of the house, away from the danger. Outside, the sirens were getting louder. Amanda hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the house. She felt like she was leaving everything behind. Her home, her life, the remnants of the life she had tried to rebuild. But there was no going back. Not now. She led Max and Sophie out the front door, her heart pounding with each step. They crossed the front yard, running toward the side street where the officer's car was parked. They would need to get far away from here, but Amanda knew they couldn't do it alone. Just as they reached the end of the driveway, Amanda saw a shadow move quickly toward them. She froze, her blood running cold. It was Derek. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the street, trying to gauge how far the officers were. They had to be close, but Derek was closer. He was moving fast, and he was intent on stopping them. Max's voice broke through her panic. "Mom, look out." Before she could react, Derek lunged at her, grabbing her arm with an iron grip. She screamed, trying to break free, but his hold was too strong. "You think you can escape?" Derek's voice was low, almost mocking. "This is only the beginning. You're all in this with me now." Amanda struggled, trying to free herself, but she could feel him pulling her back toward the shadows. Her mind was racing. If he took her kids, everything she had fought for would be gone. But just as Derek pulled harder, the sound of gunshots rang out. Amanda's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, She thought the worst. But the next second, she saw a flash of blue lights as several officers rushed toward them, their guns drawn. "Drop her!" one of the officers shouted. Derek hesitated for a split second, his eyes flicking toward the officers. That was all the time Amanda needed. She twisted her arm free, breaking Derek's grip with all her strength. She stumbled backward, falling into the arms of an officer who had come to her aid. Derek snarled, his eyes full of fury, but the officers quickly closed in on him. He had no way out. Within moments, Derek was restrained, cuffed, and dragged toward one of the squad cars. His angry shouts faded into the night. Amanda stood there, breathing heavily, her body trembling. She looked at Max and Sophie, their wide eyes full of shock. "It's over," Amanda whispered, her voice thick with relief. "It's finally over." But even as the police took Derek away, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare wasn't completely finished. Derek might be in custody, but what about the people who had been controlling him? What about the strings he had been pulling from the shadows? She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not yet. The officers who had come to their aid escorted Amanda and her children to a safer location, away from the house, away from the town that had become a prison of fear. But even as they drove further away, Amanda couldn't silence the questions that swirled in her mind. Who else was involved? What had Derek really been after? And, perhaps most frightening of all, if Derek had been the puppet who had been pulling the strings all along? As the car drove through the night, Amanda held her children close, her arms wrapped tightly around them. She knew the danger wasn't over, but for now, they were safe. For now, they could breathe. And that was enough for now.